every single one of us completely takes for granted. And no, I don't mean your smartphone, though I'm sure at least one of you is already dozing off while it charges by your bed. I mean, fire, yeah, that flickery, warm, light-making thing that humanity has basically centered its entire existence around for a few 100,000 years. It cooks your food, it heats your house, and for most of history it was the difference between being dinner and making dinner. And like most things in history, it all started with one confused, probably terrified human ancestor who stared at a burning tree and thought, yeah, I want that. So tonight, we're going to take a very long, very calm, very overly detailed journey into the history of fire. And not just fire as a chemical reaction, because honestly that would knock you out faster than any history lesson could. We're talking about the social life of fire. Who controlled it? Who messed it up? And how early humans basically built their entire civilization around keeping one very fragile little flame alive. So settle in. Dim the lights. Pretend you're huddled in a cave about 500,000 years ago listening to me ramble. Which honestly isn't that different from what's happening right now. A world without fire. Let's start by imagining life before anyone had mastered fire. No campfires, no roasted meat, no light at night except for the moon, stars, and the occasional terrifying lightning strike. If you wanted warmth, you had two options: find a cozy cave or cuddle up to a hairy stranger and hope they didn't snore. Fire was there in the world, it just wasn't in human hands yet. Volcanoes, lightning, wildfires. All those natural blazes happened, but they were more run for your life than roast marshmallows. For hundreds of thousands of years, early humans probably just stared at flames the way a toddler stares at a car engine. Fascinated, but with absolutely no clue what's going on. And to be fair, trying to touch fire is still a mistake toddlers and drunk adults make every day. The first thieves of fire. At some point, though, our ancestors decided to steal a piece of that natural fire and keep it alive. Imagine the drama. A wildfire rips through the savannah. Early humans watch in awe, and one bold person, let's call him Steve, because why not, grabs a burning stick. Steve has now brought home the ultimate new gadget. Forget iPhones, this was the original Flex. The problem was keeping fire alive was way harder than making it. For thousands of years, people didn't actually know how to start a fire. They only knew how to keep one burning. That meant if the campfire went out, you didn't just light a new one. Nope. You had to trudge back to wherever the last wildfire was, hope it was still going, and steal some embers. Imagine your whole tribe having to say, well, sorry guys, Steve fell asleep and the fire went out. Guess it's back to eating raw mammoth tonight. So firekeepers became some of the most important people in the group. Their entire job was to make sure that little ember never went out. They were basically the world's first babysitters, except the baby could burn your face off. The first cookout. Now, let's talk food. Because once humans started cooking with fire, everything changed. Before cooking, meat was chewy, roots were tough, and eating raw potatoes probably made you feel like you swallowed a brick. Cooking made food softer, tastier, and most importantly, safer. Anthropologists believe cooking is actually what helped human brains get bigger. Because when you're not wasting all your energy chewing like a cow for 8 hours a day, you can use that energy for other things, like gossip, or inventing tools, or arguing about who gets the last piece of roasted auroch. And here's the ironic part. The first people to discover cooked food probably didn't do it on purpose. They just found an animal roasted in a wildfire and thought, tastes better than the slimy stuff. And then someone else said, Yeah, but do you think we could recreate this? And boom, humanity's first dinner party. Fire as status fire wasn't just about food or warmth. It became a status symbol. Tribes who had fire were suddenly better off than tribes who didn't. You could scare away predators, survive colder nights, and roast meat instead of gnawing on it like a desperate raccoon. Think of fire as the original VIP lounge. If your group had it, you were in. If not, well, enjoy freezing to death. And because fire was so powerful, it also became one of the first sacred things in human culture. Early myths and legends across the world tell stories of fire being stolen from the gods, gifted by tricksters, or guarded by jealous spirits. Which makes sense, because to early humans, fire was basically magic. It could destroy, it could protect, it could transform raw meat into a delicious meal. And unlike magic tricks today, it didn't require a top hat. The first failures. Of course, humans being humans, things went wrong. People burned themselves, burned their shelters, and probably lost more than a few eyebrows to over-enthusiastic experiments. Imagine someone discovering fire for the first time and then immediately dropping a flaming stick into a pile of dry grass. Congratulations, Steve. You've just invented arson. And then there were the social dynamics. Whoever controlled the fire controlled the group. If the firekeeper got cranky, they could just refuse to share. Oh, you want some warmth? Too bad, should have been nicer when I asked for your mammoth bone. So fire also introduced humanity to politics and manipulation, and probably the world's first passive-aggressive campfire arguments. Fire and storytelling. Now here's where things get cozy. Once you've got a fire burning at night, people don't just eat and sleep, they sit around and talk. They tell stories. They gossip about who's bad at hunting, who fell in the river, and who has suspiciously good hair for a caveman. Fire didn't just make food better, it made culture possible. Those hours sitting around the fire became the birthplace of myths, legends, and bedtime stories. Which means that the very first human history lesson probably happened around a campfire. You're literally listening to me right now in the digital version of that tradition. Congratulations. You're part of an unbroken chain of people falling asleep to boring stories by firelight. Fire in the archaeological record. Now let's slow down and get needlessly technical, because this is, after all, supposed to help you fall asleep. Archaeologists have found evidence of controlled fire use going back at least 400,000 years, maybe even earlier. Sites in Israel, South Africa and Europe all show signs of ancient hearths, basically circles of stones with ash in the middle. Some of these hearths were used over and over again, which means people were deliberately building and maintaining them. You can almost picture the scene. A few tired hominins crouched around, trying not to cough on the smoke, desperately hoping the spark doesn't go out. It's not glamorous, but it was the difference between survival and extinction. And yet despite this, for hundreds of thousands of years, humanity's fire-making skills barely improved. People basically just kept doing the same thing. Find it, keep it alive, and pray it doesn't rain. Because if it did, well, there goes dinner. Alright, so we've established that early humans were basically pyromaniac raccoons. Fascinated by fire, good at stealing it, not so good at making it. For hundreds of thousands of years, people just carried burning sticks around like the world's most fragile cell phones. Keep it alive, recharge with more wood, and for heaven's sake, don't drop it in a puddle. But eventually, someone out there, maybe Steve's great-great-great-great-granddaughter, or someone with slightly more brain cells, figured out that you could create fire without waiting for lightning to fry a tree. This was the true game changer. Humanity went from borrowing the gods' lighter to having their very own Bic. So let's wander slowly into the long and awkward history of fire-making technologies. And yes, I promise it's exactly as boring and slow as it sounds. The stick rubbing method, aka history's first gym membership. The first big breakthrough was friction fire, which, in plain terms, is rub sticks together until one of them cries, "Uncle." It sounds simple, but if you've ever tried it, you'll know it's basically cardio disguised as innovation. Imagine some poor Neanderthal hunched over, sweating, rubbing two sticks together for hours. His friends are standing around, probably making unhelpful comments like, "Maybe rub faster," or "Wow, that's a lot of smoke, but no fire." And when it finally works and a tiny little ember appears, everyone gasps as if he just pulled a rabbit out of a hat. And of course someone else immediately sneezes on it and ruins the whole thing. Now, this friction method came in a few varieties. The hand drill, where you twirl a stick between your palms. The bow drill, where you cheat with a little bowstring to spin the stick faster. And the fire plough, where you literally scrape one stick against another in a groove. Basically, prehistoric humans were reinventing CrossFit. And honestly, it worked. Eventually, Flint and Steel, the original Tinder app. Then came the next upgrade, hitting rocks together, specifically striking flint against steel or flint against certain minerals, to create sparks. This method was faster, easier, and less sweaty, though still not foolproof. So picture a medieval peasant out in the woods, hunched over his little tinder bundle, and no, not the app, actual dried grass. He strikes flint against iron 12 times, sparks fly. He blows gently, trying not to pass out. Finally, the tinder glows. The fire catches, and then the wind blows it out. Congratulations! Jeff, you've just wasted your afternoon. But when it did work, this method was so reliable that it became the standard for thousands of years. People carried little tinder boxes with them, complete with flint, steel and some dry fluff to ignite. It was basically the EDC kit of the Middle Ages. Knights had swords, peasants had pitchforks, and everybody had a little box of sad, half-burned lint. Fire as ritual, sacred flames and eternal embers. Now, once humans could actually make fire, they didn't just stop there, because humanity never stops at useful tool. We always have to overcomplicate things with rituals, symbolism, and unnecessary drama. Take ancient Greece, for example. They had sacred hearth fires that were never supposed to go out. Temples kept eternal flames burning for the gods. The Vestal Virgins in Rome had one job: keep the sacred fire alive. If it went out, it wasn't just inconvenient, it was a sign of cosmic doom. And the poor priestess responsible usually got punished, because nothing says healthy workplace like blaming someone for a draft. Other cultures had their own sacred flames too. In Zoroastrianism, fire temples maintained carefully tended flames that symbolized purity and the divine. In Japan, certain shrines have kept ritual fires burning for centuries, which sounds impressive until you realize it just means a bunch of people have been taking turns babysitting the same campfire since the Middle Ages. The royal obsession with fire. And of course, royals got in on the fire symbolism, because if there's one thing monarchs love, it's taking credit for natural forces. Kings claimed to rule by divine fire. Queens posed with torches like they were cosplaying as goddesses. Entire coronation ceremonies involved torches, hearths and candles, because apparently nothing says fit to rule like holding something flammable while wearing several pounds of hairspray and brocade. Fire also became a convenient metaphor for royal passion, divine right, and when things went badly, the fires of rebellion, which meant medieval monarchs spent a lot of time both literally and figuratively surrounded by flames, sometimes symbolic, sometimes not so much. Fire as destruction, because humans can't help themselves. Of course, once you give humanity control of fire, someone's going to weaponize it. Fire wasn't just for cooking and storytelling anymore, it was for burning down your enemy's house, city, or, occasionally, their entire civilization. Take the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. Nero supposedly fiddled while it burned, and though historians agree he probably didn't, because fiddles weren't invented yet. But still, the rumour stuck. Why? Because it fit the vibe. Rome was burning, and the emperor was basically the ancient world's version of that guy who watches his sim drown in the pool while eating chips. Or the countless medieval sieges where armies set fire to castles, villages and crops. Fire was the original total war strategy. If you can't beat them, burn everything they own and call it a day. Efficient, destructive, and definitely not cosy bedtime material. But don't worry, we're not going to dwell on the gore. Just imagine some peasants sadly watching their hay bales go up in smoke. Tragic, but also predictable. Fire and everyday life. Back in the everyday world, fire was everything. Cooking, heating, lighting. Without it, life was basically impossible. But it was also a massive hassle. Fires smoked up your house, filled your lungs with soot, and made your clothes smell like a barbecue. Which, ironically, is exactly how some modern hipster restaurants still want you to smell. In medieval towns, fire hazards were constant. Thatched roofs, wooden beams, open flames. Basically a giant matchbox waiting to go up. Cities like London burned down so often it was practically a hobby. The Great Fire of London in 1666 was the big one, but smaller fires happened constantly, which meant fire was both your best friend and your worst nightmare. The snobbery of fire. And yes, even something as universal as fire got tangled in class differences. The rich had multiple hearths in their houses, roaring away, while the poor huddled around a single smoky pit. The wealthy burned fine wood or imported coal. The poor burned whatever they could find. Sticks, dung, peat. Imagine the joy of coming home after a long day of labour, only to heat your dinner over a pile of smouldering cow patties. Nothing says relaxing evening like eau de barnier. Fire also shaped architecture. Big medieval halls had massive central hearths with smoke drifting up through the rafters. Later, chimneys became a status symbol. Because nothing says, "I've made it," like not dying of smoke inhalation in your own living room. Alright, so we've covered the basics. Cavemen sweating over sticks, medieval peasants choking on chimney smoke, and royals pretending they invented fire because they held a torch at their coronation. Cozy stuff. But here's where things get a little hotter. At some point, humans stopped just using fire for warmth and cooking. They decided to experiment with it, which is always dangerous when humans are involved. You know the type, the curious one who says, "What if we throw this random object in and see what happens?" That person is responsible for about half of human progress, and about half of human disasters. And with fire, the throw things in and see approach eventually led to one of the biggest changes in history, metallurgy. Rocks plus fire equals surprise, shiny stuff. Here's the setup. You've got early humans sitting around a fire. They've got rocks lying around, as people tend to do. At some point, someone tossed some of those rocks into the flames, maybe by accident, maybe out of boredom, maybe because their cousin Greg dared them to. And then something weird happened. Instead of just blackened stones, they noticed little globs of shiny metal oozing out. Probably copper, one of the first metals humans managed to smelt. Now, imagine seeing that for the first time. You throw in a rock and suddenly it bleeds liquid sparkle. That had to look like magic. Or witchcraft. Or both. Of course, instead of freaking out and leaving it alone, like any sensible species might have done, humans said, "Cool. Let's make more." And thus began our long and complicated relationship with metal. The first metal. Copper was the gateway drug of metallurgy. It was relatively easy to smelt, it looked nice, and it could be hammered into shapes without too much effort. Early humans started making jewellery, tools and ornaments out of it. Was copper particularly strong? Not really. If you tried to stab someone with a pure copper spear, it bent faster than your uncle's folding chair at a barbecue. But it was shiny, it was new, and it screamed status, which meant elites loved it. If you were a fancy person in the Copper Age, you probably owned some ridiculously impractical copper trinket just to show off, like the original Apple Watch, but heavier and more orange. Bronze, humanity levels up. Of course, humans being humans, they didn't stop there. Someone, again probably out of boredom, decided to mix copper with tin, and the result was bronze, stronger, sharper, and way more useful. Welcome to the Bronze Age, where suddenly everything was bronze: tools, weapons, helmets, decorative hairpins. If it could be cast in bronze, someone made it. And naturally, kings and rulers hoarded the best bronze goodies, while peasants got whatever scraps were left. Bronze became a symbol of power. If your army had it, you were terrifying. If you didn't, you were toast. And let's be honest, most rulers weren't exactly subtle about it. Imagine a Bronze Age king walking into a meeting decked out head to toe in bronze bling. Helmet, sword, shield, probably even a bronze spoon just to flex. Meanwhile, the peasants are out there farming with sticks. Truly social equality at its finest. Iron, because bronze wasn't dramatic enough. Eventually, humanity stumbled onto iron. And here's the thing about iron, it's harder to smelt. You need hotter fires and better furnaces. But once people figured it out, it was game over. Iron tools, iron swords, iron ploughs. It was stronger, sharper, and everywhere. The Iron Age didn't just make life easier. It made wars nastier. Armies armed with iron weapons could steamroll their bronze-wielding neighbours, which of course rulers absolutely loved. Because if history has one recurring theme, it's that monarchs never met a shiny new killing tool they didn't adore. And with iron, societies started building bigger cities, cutting down more forests and farming more aggressively, which meant more food, more people and more problems. Fire had gone from keep us warm at night to let's reconfigure the planet for fun. Fire as industrial obsession. Fast forward a bit and fire was no longer just something you cooked with. It powered forges, kilns, glass making, and eventually entire cities. Every new technology seemed to involve hotter and hotter flames. Blacksmiths became rock stars of the medieval world. Furnaces roared day and night, and anyone who could control those fires controlled wealth and power. Kings built entire industries around fire. They monopolized iron production, taxed blacksmiths, and bragged about their massive furnaces like they were showing off their car collection. A ruler with a strong metalworking industry was basically flexing on the international stage. Oh, your army still uses wooden spears? Cute. We've got iron swords and matching iron soup ladles. Royal meltdowns, literally. And let's not forget the royals themselves, many of whom developed bizarre obsessions with metallurgy. Take Emperor Nero, for example. When he wasn't busy being blamed for setting Rome on fire, he also had a thing for showy experiments. He reportedly enjoyed messing around with alchemy, basically the ancient pseudoscience of trying to turn random junk into gold. Spoiler, it didn't work. But that didn't stop countless kings, emperors and princes from bankrupting their treasuries chasing the dream. In fact, for centuries, rulers sponsored alchemists to sit around and play with fire, melting stuff in furnaces and promising that any day now they'd crack the code to unlimited gold. Of course, what they really cracked was a lot of glassware and their patrons' patience. But it gave us chemistry in the long run, so thanks, I guess. Everyday metallurgy. The peasant edition. Meanwhile, for regular folks, metallurgy was less glamorous and more smoky. Blacksmith shops were loud, dirty, and smelled like a cross between a barbecue and a coal mine. Villagers relied on their local smith for everything. Tools, nails, horseshoes, weapons. If the smith was good, life ran smoothly. If the smith was bad, your plough broke mid-season and you starved. But blacksmiths also had a weird mystique. They worked with fire and metal, which seemed magical to people who didn't understand it. In many cultures, smiths were seen as part craftsman, part wizard, part social outcast. Because nothing screams mystical aura like being covered in soot 24/7. Fire and royal kitchens, because eating is power too. And let's not forget food. Royal kitchens used fire on an absurd scale. Medieval banquets required massive hearths, multiple spits, and armies of cooks sweating over open flames. Roasting an entire deer or a dozen swans wasn't just dinner, it was a power move. Of course, it wasn't exactly efficient. Kitchens frequently caught fire, servants got burned, and food came out half-charred or undercooked. But the point wasn't flavour. The point was excess. Nothing says, "I'm king," like serving a pie that has live birds flying out of it when you cut it open. Which, yes, was an actual thing. And yes, it probably ended with several people coughing on feathers. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still awake, impressive. If not, well, mission accomplished, but let's pretend you're here with me, still gently floating through the history of fire. So far, we've gone from cavemen making sparks to medieval kings burning down their kitchens in the name of banquets. Cute. But now it's time for fire to get a little less cozy. Because once humans discovered coal and steam, fire wasn't just for warming your toes anymore, it became the engine of entire nations. And yes, that meant even more royal weirdness. Coal, black rock, big problems. Let's start with coal. Coal was basically the superstar fuel of the Industrial Revolution. It burned hotter and longer than wood, which meant bigger fires, bigger furnaces, and bigger everything. If fire was the toddler stage of human progress, coal was the awkward teenager. Loud, messy, and constantly leaving smoke everywhere. At first, coal was just dug up by peasants who got sent into terrifyingly deep holes in the ground. Early miners had no safety equipment, no ventilation, and absolutely no clue how bad it was for their lungs. But hey, it was cheap fuel, so kings and industrialists couldn't get enough of it. The thing about coal is that it didn't just warm houses, it powered industries. Suddenly you could run bigger forges, smelt more iron, and build massive factories. It was like fire on steroids. Unfortunately, it also turned entire cities into giant ashtrays. London, for example, was so smoggy by the 19th century that people described the air as pea soup. Delicious, steam, humans, harness, fire for transport. Now once you've got all this coal, you start wondering, what else can we set on fire? And someone eventually realised, if you boil water with coal fires, the steam can push things around. Enter the steam engine. Suddenly fire wasn't just about cooking or smelting, it was about movement. Trains, ships, factories, all of them ran on fire, turned into steam. Humanity had literally bottled flame power into engines, and it changed everything. Of course, royals couldn't just let commoners have fun with trains and steamships. Oh no. Monarchs had to make it about themselves. Queen Victoria, for instance, was famously terrified of riding trains at first, probably because they looked like giant fire-breathing dragons. But once she got over it, she had her own special royal train carriage, naturally decorated in ridiculous luxury, while peasants rattled along in wooden boxes. Because, as always, nothing says monarchy like pretending you invented something the peasants already use, but in velvet. Industrial cities smoke as a lifestyle. Coal-fired cities weren't exactly pleasant places to live. By the mid-1800s, entire urban centres were covered in soot. Everything was black. Buildings, streets, laundry, even people's lungs. Doctors politely called it respiratory distress. Everyone else just called it coughing up coal dust every morning. And yet, rulers and politicians bragged about their modern industrial power. Imagine living in a city where the sun was basically optional because the smoke blocked it out. But hey, your monarch got to open a new railway line and smile for the painters. Priorities. Royal train obsessions. Speaking of railways, let's talk monarchs and trains. Because honestly, they couldn't resist. Tsar Nicholas I of Russia, for example, was obsessed with railways, but also hilariously paranoid when he built the first big railway between Moscow and St. Petersburg. Petersburg, the legend goes that he wanted the straightest possible line. So he supposedly took a ruler, drew a straight path on the map and said, "Build it like that." Unfortunately, the line went directly over swamps, which meant maintenance nightmares forever. Efficiency. Royal style. Meanwhile, Queen Victoria's train had thick curtains, so she wouldn't have to look peasants in the eye as she zipped past them. Because apparently seeing farmers for more than 5 seconds was exhausting. Steamships. Fire on water. Then there were steamships. Imagine being on the open sea, powered not by sails, but by literal fire in your belly. That's what steamships were, giant, floating furnaces. They were faster, more reliable, and less dependent on the wind, which meant, of course, that colonial empires went wild for them. British royals, French royals, basically everyone with a crown, started commissioning massive steam-powered yachts. Because if you were going to rule half the world, you might as well do it from the deck of a fire-breathing ocean palace. The downside? Fires on steamships were common. Boilers exploded, ships burned, and lots of people didn't make it home. But hey, at least the king had a nice view before everything went up in smoke. Fire and factories. Coal and steam also gave us factories, and let's just say, factories were not exactly cosy bedtime places. They were loud, hot, and smoky. Workers stood next to roaring furnaces, often for 12 hours straight. Child labour. Oh, absolutely. Kids were sent to crawl under steaming machines because they were small enough to fit. Safety was not a priority. Meanwhile, monarchs toured these factories once in a while to look connected to the people. They'd walk through for 10 minutes, nod politely at workers covered in soot, and then leave for a banquet, probably served on silver plates polished with coal dust. Coal-fired royal luxuries. Of course, monarchs didn't just use fire for industry. They also used it to fuel their increasingly absurd luxuries. Palaces had massive coal-burning furnaces to keep things warm, especially in drafty stone castles that were basically giant refrigerators. The bigger the palace, the more coal you needed. Versailles, for example, reportedly burned through ridiculous amounts just to make sure royals didn't shiver in their golden bedrooms. And while peasants were coughing through freezing winters with one tiny hearth, royals were basically running full-scale coal plants just to take warm baths. Classic. Fire as pollution. Royals finally notice. By the late 19th century, even royals started noticing that the whole coal and smoke lifestyle was not great. Queen Victoria herself apparently complained about the smog in London, which was rich considering her empire was running half the world's coal plants. But did that stop them from burning more? Absolutely not. Governments passed a few polite clean air laws which nobody enforced, and the fires kept burning. After all, fire meant progress, and progress meant power. And monarchs, as always, were addicted to both. Fire as status symbol. It's funny, throughout history fire always circled back to status. First it was, who can keep a hearth going? Then it was, who has the shiniest bronze? Then, whose palace burns the most coal? It was never really about the practical side. It was always about showing off. And by the 19th century, royals weren't just showing off with fire. They were building entire fiery spectacles. Fireworks became a favourite royal pastime, especially in France and England. Nothing says we're in touch with the people like lighting thousands of pounds of explosives in the sky while peasants can't afford candles.